Welcome back to another episode of the Penalty Box. I'm your host today, Dominic Rossi, and this week we're going to be talking about a recently developed trade deadline story right after this. Longtime Penguins forward Jake Guentzel has been probably the biggest name at this year's deadline. A lot of fans have speculated that he'd be traded to a contender before March 8th, but no one knew exactly which contender that would be, until about 2 hours before the filming of this episode. Reporter Chris Johnston tweeted that the Canucks have interest in Jake Guentzel, but in order to make it happen, they've discussed shopping their own forward, Elias Lindholm, to the Boston Bruins. Now this trade seems pretty crazy. It's almost like one I'd make in my NHL video game franchise mode. It's two big names in a possible three-way trade. But each team has something to look at here, and that's what we're going to be discussing right now. So to start with the Penguins, they probably have the most to gain from this. First off, they want to trade Guentzel by the evening of March 6th. So now that something is in place, or could be in place rather, they have a very realistic possibility to get that done in the time they want. Also, Pittsburgh wants either a first rounder or good young players in exchange for Guentzel. Well, Vancouver doesn't have a first round pick, and a lot of their roster players are young players that they probably don't really want to trade away. But by roping Boston in, who also doesn't have a first round pick, but more veterans on their roster, they are probably willing to trade a young player. So, Pittsburgh can deal Guentzel to Vancouver, but they can get a young player that they want from Boston. And if history's taught us anything, it's that if Boston trades you a young player that they think is underperforming, he's probably a future All-Star. Moving on to the Canucks, this trade is a little odd. Now, obviously Guentzel is a great player, and if you're contending, you want him on your roster. But the odd part of the trade is that they just got Elias Lindholm on January 31st. So he's been there for about a month. But it does make a lot of sense for them. They gave up a first rounder and 2 prospects for Lindholm. You would have to give up the same thing for Guentzel. Both players are also the same age. Their contracts both expire after the season. But when you compare their stats, Guentzel is the much better player. So, considering that you're just going to be locked into the same scenario anyways, I think the Vancouver Canucks would much rather have Jake Guentzel, and I can also see why they'd want to make this trade happen. So, it's definitely a win for those two teams. But the third team, the Boston Bruins, pose a bit of a confusing scenario in my opinion. If you recall, in 2023, they went all in at the deadline, gathering many rental players to gear up for a potential playoff run. Well, we know now that that playoff run fell very short as they lost to the Florida Panthers in the first round, and all those rentals left in free agency. On top of that, many forwards that they had before, like Taylor Hall, Patrice Bergeron, and David Krejci left anyway. A lot of people expected the Bruins to regress because of this, but they're one of the best teams in the East, and they're looking to make another run at the Stanley Cup. Now, outside of Charlie Coyle, the young centers haven't really been able to replace Bergeron or Krejci, and who can blame them? Those were 2 veterans who were with the team for a long time. But it's certainly a concern going into the playoffs. Now, if you were to get Elias Lindholm, that would give you a lot needed depth, and you would probably feel a lot better about your second, third line going into the playoffs. However, Elias Lindholm would be a rental for them, just like all those guys like Bertuzzi and Hathaway last year. And if they go all in and give up young players or picks yet again to get a rental, and it does not pan out, we could be looking at this trade with disdain in the next couple years. But I think if you're Don Sweeney, you probably pull the plug on it and make that trade anyway. Now this is all hypothetical, so who knows if it will really happen? Maybe by next week's episode, we will. But until then, I'm Dominic Rossi, and this has been The Penalty Box.